Do you ever find yourself searching for something bigger than you? For a community to be a part of? A place founded on truth and love. A place to worship the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and the Son of God. Welcome to Founded in Truth, where we're more than just a fellowship. We're a family, so welcome home.
So, as I pull the slides up, we're going to be continuing this series that we've kind of jumped into called God's Mission. And my hope throughout this series is that you would be instilled with a lens. And I was talking to someone earlier, I said, I'm not trying to do like a part 1, part 2, part 3 series and try to just do some random teaching. What I'm hoping to portray above all is a sense of how to read the Scriptures and the lenses to wear when we look over the Scriptures and what we should see. And before guys, I get the slides up. Guys, how many of you guys know that the story of the Bible, when you open up your Bibles, you have a lot of books, right? And it's like going to the library. And sometimes we lose the sense that we're reading one continuous story that all these books are contributing to. Sometimes when we read the Torah portions, we're so isolated with just these few chapters, or we're so isolated with just this one book, that we forget that it has a place in a larger story of God's mission in the Bible. And we're going to be exploring kind of the Old Testament today, the Tanakh today, and going through the story of Israel, and the story of humanity, and the story of God's vocation that He's given to us to be His image bearers. And I'll go ahead and give you a little heads up. When we get to the end of the Tanakh in the Old Testament, God has made these gross promises to humanity and to Israel. Gross promises about salvation and redemptive, almost outlandish, almost fairy tale-ish promises to humanity. And then, whether you're reading from a Jewish canon or a Christian canon, it ends. And the promises you're left with go unfulfilled. And we have this God who made these promises of salvation and redemption to reconcile all things back to the garden, and they're unfulfilled. And then we open up the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark, Luke, John. And we see this claim that this Redeemer that was promised, this King, this Son of David that was promised has come, and this huge assertion that all of these promises that God made to humanity, to Israel, are being fulfilled in this person named Yeshua, or Jesus. And when we have those lenses on, and we read through the story of the Bible, things will begin to pop out. And this figure, this person of Yeshua, this rabbi in the first century, who he is and what he did and what he spoke, everything about him becomes bigger and greater and more profound and more important. And that's what I'm hoping, if at all, if I had a goal for this series, it would be that you would walk away with some form of understanding of that. And so before we jump in, last week, did you guys enjoy last week's message? Was that kind of that was cool. And I told you a few of my sources. I told you I've been preparing for kind of this series for about the past year, 2 years, and I have a few sources, just a couple of the books that I've read over the past year and a half, 2 years, that I could remember. It may be missing some, but these are some great resources. If you guys want to go back and study the story of God's mission and the story of the Bible, one that is not on here is Christopher Wright's God's Mission. Kind of where I got the name, but Christopher, he's not on here. But we have G.K. Beale, God Dwells Among Us, Expanding Eden to the Ends of the Earth. Fantastic short book. He was one of the writers in that book. Of course, N.T. Wright, Nicholas Thomas Wright. I don't agree with everything that he writes, but I believe that God is using him to show forth the power of what the scriptural gospel is. And a couple of his books that I would recommend are The Day the Revolution Began, How God Became King, Evil and Justice of God, and Surprised by Hope. Those are some great, out of his 60-something books, those are good ones. A book named Exile edited by James Scott. Fantastic book. A great resource would be Ryan White at faithinmessiah.com, especially his series on Torah on the Mountain. Another teacher that I would highly recommend, she has a blog, is Tyler Rosenquist at ancientbridge.com. You will find her as a great resource. Walter Brueggemann's commentary on 1 Kings is fantastic when we talk about Solomon. Michael Bird, Are You the One Who Is to Come? The Historical Jesus and Messianic Question. Matthew Bates, Salvation by Allegiance Alone. And last but not least, Scott McKnight, The King Jesus Gospel, which is just amazing. So yeah, when you have some spare time, and if you're wanting to further these types of topics, these are some great resources that I do recommend. There, that was a lot. And so, all the way through the Bible, we started to see last week that the mission of God is that God will not allow the corruption and the hate and the hell that has been unleashed on His creation to have the last word. And that's essentially what He's doing in His mission. It's a story about God's mission to redeem His people, call them back, and have them reconciled to Him and restore the goodness to His own creation. And so, one thing I want to express is when we read the Bible, sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that it's just a story back then. When we read the story of Exodus and Genesis and so on and so forth, we tend to look at them as like history, and it's just history. And for those of you who know me personally, I hate that word just. It bothers me because it usually minimizes whatever it is doing. You know, when someone asks you to do something, hey, can you just like fix this thing? And it's just like, well, it's not just a just. It's a bigger deal than that. Okay? The Bible is more than just a just, right? It's not a just, okay? It's not just history. It's showing us a story that is possibly taking place right now, in your life even. Not simply for the ancient Israelites, but possibly for your life, and it will possibly be a story that takes place in the next generation's life, and so on and so forth. And the book of Genesis has stories and great legends, and it has drama and lessons, and it has drama, and Genesis 33 is like the soap opera of the beginning of the Bible. Philosophy, love, hate, all kinds of stuff in Genesis. And then we come to the next book, which is the book of Exodus. And in Exodus, we see a people, Israel, and they're in Egypt, and Egypt is like the world superpower, which is ruled by a pharaoh, and Pharaoh reacts to this massive influx of Israelite population by forced labor. What's another word for forced labor? Slavery. All right, that term's going to come up a few times over the next little bit. And he oppresses them. He forces them to make bricks, make massive buildings for his empire. He even orders that all of their male children be killed in an attempt to kind of cap the population. Egypt is an empire built on the backs of slaves. It is what it is. And as we read this intense story, something happens. And Israel is crying out. And do I have it? Yeah. Exodus 3:7, we're introduced to this God of the Israelites. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering. So God looks down and He hears the cries of His people. And He hears the cries of the oppression that they are under. And He hears the cries of their suffering. And the Hebrew word here is sa'ak, I think is how you pronounce it when I looked it up. It means to cry out. And it expresses pain, suffering. It's the sound that you make when you're struck, when you're wounded, when you're knocked down. This was the word this is the cry that Abel's blood made from the ground. God heard the cries of His people. And Exodus is extremely important, extremely because it shows us who God is. And God is a God who responds to the cries of the afflicted and the oppressed. It's His character. And this is a time when Israel is transformed, where Israel evolves. Think of a time in your life where you grew or you had a transformation that took place in your life. Anybody kind of think of like, a time where, it was a real growing moment for you? I bet those times were marked with anxiety and stress and perhaps pain and suffering. Perhaps when you felt you could not go on. Exodus comes through a cry throughout the biblical narrative. And when Israel cried out, God heard, God acted, and Israel was transformed. And to understand the backdrop behind Exodus, everything that kind of leads up to the story of Exodus, we need to understand why the writer pins the story of the garden in the way that they do. And so traditionally we believe Moses wrote the Torah. And so if Moses wrote the book of Genesis and the garden and the whole story about the garden, why did he write it the way he did? He could have added details. He could have had less details. I mean, ancient storytelling was an art form, okay? Take the poetry in Genesis 1, the creation poem. It's a testimony. It's beautiful testimony of how great our God is, right? And it was written in such to portray that. That was the motive behind it. And so he chose to tell the story of Eden with a specific flow, with specific words, with specific things to try to engage us. And when we understand that, we start to understand that the story of the garden is not just some historical biography, but more. It isn't something that just took place, but it's something that lays the foundation for the rest of Scripture that we see. You'll see a pattern of the garden showing up over and over and over again throughout all of the Scriptures. And the story of the garden actually escalates very quickly. It's definitely not a J.R.R. Tolkien book. And it goes from everything being good in this garden, and then someone eats some fruit, and then within one generation of murder ensues. Murder is created. Within one generation of taking a bite of fruit, murder. And people are starting to slaughter each other, and things are falling apart very quickly since Adam and Eve chose autonomy from God. Very quickly. It's just going downhill fast. And a few generations later, we have Lamech, the ancestor of Cain, declaring in Genesis 4:24, if Cain is avenged 7 times, Lamech will be avenged 77 times, right? And this is right after he killed some young kid from out the North. He's bragging about it to his wives. He's singing them a song. It's actually a poem. Eat some fruit, murder a family member, and now the world, poetically put, is 11 times worse than it was. This is escalating quickly. Very much so. Not even 6 chapters into creation of the universe, every single person on earth is yearning to use violence to further their own agendas of oppression and corruptness. The entire world is striving to make evil their God, except for one family of Noah. And the story goes on to say that God attempts to prevent this massive violent influx all over the world and this evil, so God decides to use violence to battle this violence on the world. And so he floods the world and he drowns every man, woman, and child except for Noah and his family. Now this is one of those stories that we read, and the author is portraying this story in a certain way. And he's wanting us to ask a question. Did it work? Did God flooding the world and using violence to fight violence work? Did violence happen after the flood? Did evil continue after the flood? Kind of sounds like something Yeshua would say, isn't it? So there's a lesson there. This is layers. And in chapter 11, a mass people set a common goal to build a tower, the Tower of Babel, seeing themselves as God. And the one motive of Adam and Eve to be likened unto God seems to be within all of us, doesn't it? I can do this. I can define evil better than God. I can define good better than God. I don't need God in all areas of my life. I can do this alone. Yeah. The story starts out with a bad decision involving food and leads to the entire world being against the will, the sovereignty, and the reign of God. Things are not looking so good. The desires of the human heart are overtaking the globe, and it's not good. Creation is no longer good. And it's not because God made it that way. It's because we have created hell here. We have corrupted God's good creation. And so in Egypt, we have a Pharaoh and taskmasters oppressing the Israelites. And I want you guys to imagine living during this time period in Egypt. Imagine wives waking up with their husbands every morning, and you know they're about to leave for their work, you know, in the day, and you make them some over easy eggs that are really runny with some hot queso cheese on top and salsa and really extra hot sauce for their husbands, and you give them a kiss goodnight, a kiss goodbye, and have a great day, honey, right? And then your husband comes home bloody and beaten, ready to collapse because his taskmaster increased his daily workload and he couldn't make the minimum. And as the children are running up to comfort their father, as he's bruised and battered, and the wife is just sitting there. Why are they doing this to us? Why are they beating us now? Why? The decree is then announced that if you give birth to a male, it must be killed, drowned. Why are they killing our children now? Why? Your husband comes home and says, yeah, we have to bring our own straw to make the bricks now. Our own straw, we can't. What? Oh, and they doubled our workload again. Why are they doing this? Honey, you have to stand up to this. They beat Rachel's husband to death today, leaving behind his 4 children, honey. Why is this happening? You can feel the oppression of what this is causing. Bricks. Make bricks. It pushes that in there because where have we seen bricks before? Oh yeah, the Tower of Babel. Bricks. What is driving the Egyptian expansion is fear of not being able to be on top and conquer. Fear of falling behind and maybe leading technology, fear of not profiting, fear of not being secure. And they relieve these fears through oppressing and exploiting others, enslaving them, threatening others. And this is a product of a bite of fruit. This is what led all of this to happen. This is a product of sin. Sin started in the hearts of a few and has now infected the entire world. And the entire world is now subject to this force that exists. This force that is not supposed to be here. This force that is against the reign of God. This force that slithered in. This force that whispers, surely you can do better than God. Surely you can be like God. This is Egypt. This is Pharaoh. And this is a kingdom opposed to God's kingdom. This is hell. And there's a people at the bottom being oppressed, weighed down, no hope, no strength, only a cry to who? God. And this is where God acts. This is where he steps in. And God sends a man by the name of Moses, a shepherd, to lead his people, the oppressed, out of Egypt. And he goes face to face, toe to toe with Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's looking at him like, who is your God? Who is this Yahweh? Like, who do you serve? Like, I don't even know who this God is. I've never heard of him. What does he stand for? Why does he want me to let Israel go? And God speaks to Moses, and he says something that there's tons of commentary on, but I love it. He speaks to Moses in Exodus 7:1, and he says, and the Lord said to Moses, see, I have made you like God to Pharaoh. Aaron's going to be your prophet. I have made you, and like there isn't even in the Hebrew. I've made you God to Pharaoh. We see something here. We see that God wants to be seen in flesh and blood. Moses, you will be me to Pharaoh. See, last week we spoke about God working through his creation to dispel corruption. This is not Moses' idea. This is God's initiative. Pharaoh is going to see who this God is in this world, here and now. And how this God responds in this world, here and now. And he's going to see how this God liberates in this world, here and now. This is the God that redeems. This is the God that saves. And Moses and Pharaoh go back and forth, and God sends a multitude of plagues, and all of this drama and conflict lead up to one final ceremony that is commanded by God. A lamb must die. The flesh must be eaten. And the blood will be the blood of this covenant that is happening. The blood stands as a sign of redemption. And God will pass over and protect these homes from this angel that is sent forth to take these firstborns. And the blood is going to save from death. Not only that, the blood is going to represent who God's own is. Israelites leave Egypt. They travel for about 3 days, and then they come to a sea, and they cross through this Red Sea. This is a baptism into a nation, an assembly. Paul calls it the baptism of Moses in 1 Corinthians 10. Baptism. Baptism represents entering into the assembly of God. But the story is not over. It's only beginning. Where does God lead them next? These former slaves, this oppressed nation, these former abuse victims, where are they led next? To Sinai. And at Sinai, the mountain of God, everyone say the mountain? For next week. God speaks to the multitude. And this is the first time that God speaks to a multitude of people, or more than one, since Eden, if I'm not mistaken. Abraham, Moses, multitude. He's speaking to multitude of people. And the people come to the mountain, and God tells Moses to remind the people of the exodus from Egypt. And it's important to remind them of the exodus from Egypt. And every single thing that they do needs to be a remembrance of the exodus from Egypt. God is harping on one thing, and he wants them to remember the exodus of Egypt. Deuteronomy 5 states that we should keep the Sabbath. Why? To remind us from God's redemption and exodus from Egypt. Not the beginning of the world, not that God rested on the Sabbath. No, to remind you that I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Everything is to remind you of your exodus from Egypt. Exodus 19:4 states, "You have seen what I did unto the Egyptians and how I bear you on eagle's wings." Eagle's what? "And brought you unto myself. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be a kingdom of," what's that word? "Priests and a holy nation." And these are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. So God wants to make these people that he has given new life to into a kingdom of priests. And what does that mean? What does a priest do? Right? A priest mediates between God and man, if I can be simplistic with it. When you go and see like a Catholic priest or a Greek Orthodox priest or a Buddhist priest or priest of any religion, what are they doing? They're trying to show you who their God is. And God is making this kingdom, this oppressed slaves, a nation that is going to be the priests to the world. And their job is to show everybody through flesh and blood who their God is. And they're to be a holy nation. And so we always see holy and we think of set apart, being set apart. And it does mean set apart. The issue comes in is when we define what set apart is. We look at someone else and we purposely make ourselves look unapproachable in the name of being set apart, when we really just want to feel special and to claim that God loves us more than everyone else. And that's not what this is talking about. That's not what this is talking about. The Pharisees got called out for that type of attitude. What type of set apart are they supposed to be set apart? Like, what is supposed to define them? Set apart from what? Are we reading the same story that we've been reading in Genesis? Right? All the way up? So the story that started in the garden, right? Where a son murders his brother. Where a lineage infects the world with hate and violence. Where violence overtakes the entire world. Where the world joins together to make themselves a god. Where violence overtakes everything. Where all nations are seeking to structure success based on abusing the weak. Yeah, set apart from that. Set apart from being Egypt. That's what set apart means. We're gonna introduce the idea that keeping Sabbath and not eating pig, keeping Passover or Sukkot, God hates a particular people who does those things and really is not set apart. This people, these former slaves, are being molded into a nation not built on greed, not built on violence, not built on abusing the weak, but on justice, righteousness, compassion, mercy, and love. And then God gives Israel the Ten Commandments and the rest of the Torah, a gift that signified how to walk out this kingdom that God is introducing to them. From commandments to love one another, to commandments about taking the Lord's name in vain, or carry the name of God with you with integrity. Exodus 22:25 is great because God specifically commands, he says, if you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Don't charge interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset, because the cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? And when they cry out to me, I will hear, and I am compassionate. I will hear when they cry out. Earlier, verse 21 and 22, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. In other words, don't be Egypt. Do not take advantage of the widow of the fatherless. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. Leviticus 19:14, do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God, I am the Lord. Don't be a jerk. Why? Because you're representing God. You're His image. You're His priest. Don't be a jerk. Fear God. Why do we need to fear God? Because God will hear their cries if they cry out because of you. God will do the same thing to you like He did to the Egyptians if you turn into the Egyptians. Remember, I am the Lord your God that brought you out of the land of Egypt. You were oppressed, I redeemed you. Don't be Egypt. And God wants them to demonstrate their faith through how they walk and how being this redeemed people manifests. By how they don't forget, by how they themselves treat the poor and the widows and the orphans, the weak, the suffering. How many of you know that entitlement does something to people? Entitlement does something. Not only does it make you immune from gratitude. You can't be grateful for something you feel entitled to. Yeah, that's a big lesson. It also immunizes you to the suffering of others. Because if someone is poor and they're suffering and they're needy, obviously they didn't work hard enough like I did. Therefore, well, I'm not needy because I worked hard. They should have. They could have done more. You see how that entitlement mentality works? And logically it makes sense. That's the kicker. But God's telling His people, His priests, yeah, that's not the logic that I use. It's not the logic I use. After Israel received the Torah from God, they're told a list of blessings, right? We know this big list. And they also got a list of what? Curses, right? Curses that they would surely endure if they absorbed Egypt's identity. Did they get all of the blessings? Did they keep the covenant? Did they break the covenant? It's fascinating. When you read through Deuteronomy 28 and 29, like, you know, people are pushing me. It's like, dude, you got to introduce Benjamin to the Torah. Like, he's going to be 3 next year, and you got to start reading the Torah to him. And I'm like, I'm not going to read him the end of Deuteronomy. Are you kidding me? Yeah, but you got to raise him up. You got to teach him the ways of God. I'm going to read him John. How about that? Like, he's going to learn John, and that's the foundation of everything else. No, I'm not going to read him the story of Noah's Ark when he's 3 or 4 years old. No. I'm not going to read him about the awful curses that God is going to put on Israel. No. Sorry. I have an outline, so I don't do stuff like that. So I apologize. So, skip ahead a few generations. We're going to skip ahead just a few generations, and this former slave nation settles into the land promised to Abraham. And why was Abraham given this land? For those of you who know, Genesis 12 states it was given to him, these blessings, this wealth, this land was given to him so that the nation that settles in it, his seed, will bless others. Genesis 12:1. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing, that you'll be a blessing to others. So Abram was equipped, and Israel was becoming equipped to do their job as the priests of God, as the image bearers of God. And these former slaves, the seed of Abraham, enter the land promised to their forefathers, and they settle there. And all 12 tribes are gathered around under this king, famous king, known as King David. And David is a man known as someone who was a man after God's own heart, right? And he is a king that, although imperfect, understatement, although a king that had some issues in his life, he allows himself to be used by God. And this is like the high point of Israel's story. We're here. We're at like the highest point they've been at. And David secures the borders, and Israel is finally experiencing the complete shalom and peace after generations of struggle and warfare. And God decides to make a promise to David in 2 Samuel 7:12. And this is important. It says, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, you're going to die, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom, and he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. God told you that for your son, you would be pretty content, right? Yeah, heck yeah, I mean, this is great, you know? And David indeed does have a son by the name of Solomon, and who becomes king after him. And Solomon was brilliant, he was strong, he was he was Shlomo, I mean, he was a manly man, right? Like this guy, manly man. And he takes his father's plan to build God's temple, and he puts it into motion. And he is the one that finally builds the much anticipated temple of God. No longer is God going to dwell in a tent, but he's going to dwell in a permanent structure in Jerusalem, and God's glory will have a home and it will manifest there. And Solomon in Jerusalem is gaining a reputation across all of the lands, all of the world. And kings are making deals, and political agendas of peace are being met, and it's wonderful. Great wealth is pouring into Israel during Solomon's reign. What could go wrong? This queen from very far off, queen from Sheba, right? She comes for a visit. And Queen Sheba, she's a pagan, it happens. And she's not an Israelite, which means she's a pagan. And she comes from a different background, and she worships different gods, and she has a different culture and a different people and just different. And she comes, and she wants to find out about this Israel. She wants to find out about this King Solomon. She wants to find out about this God of the Israelites. And so this culture of people. And so she comes, and what's happening in the scriptures is this is like a reversal of the Tower of Babel. Like all the nations are dispersed, and now the light is starting to flicker for Israel. They're becoming this well-known, they're representing God. The light's starting to flicker, people are seeing it, and all the nations are coming back to participate in building God's house and securing the border and being friends. And no more battles, no more wars are breaking out. This is good. This is good. Violence are starting to stop is always a good thing, okay? So this is what's happening. And this kingdom of priests is starting to form. And in 1 Kings chapter 10, Sheba comes, Queen Sheba comes, and she wants to come and ask Solomon hard questions. Why? Because she found out he was kind of smart. So I'm going to go take some riddles or something to him. I'm going to ask him some hard questions. And she sat with him day and night, asking him questions, inquiring, gaining his wisdom. And he took her on tours around his house, showed her the temple, the city. She watches how he worships God in the temple. She watches how he does things. She's inspecting the culture. She's like, wow, like this is a legit nation. And in 1 Kings 10:9, she says this. This pagan queen. She says, "Blessed be the Lord your God. Blessed be Yahweh your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king, that you may execute justice and righteousness." So Sheba states, right, or Queen of Sheba states that Solomon was made king so he could do what? Execute justice and righteousness. Not to maintain it. This is what you're going to do. See, she's realizing why Solomon was given the power and the authority and the wisdom and the wealth and all of this. She realizes why this was all given to Solomon. See, Solomon prayed for wisdom, and God gave him wealth and power on top of it to rule God's people and execute justice and righteousness. Justice and righteousness is a way of saying Solomon was meant to rule a kingdom where the oppression does not occur. Oppression, violence does not occur. The abuse of power is non-existent, where Solomon would act on behalf of the poor, the powerless, that this kingdom would fully represent the God whose reputation is freeing slaves and empowering them to rise above their situations to show forth his redemptive work. So that's why God empowered Solomon, gave him the tools to equip him. And Solomon has this power, and he has this wealth, and he has this authority, and he has this wisdom. Does he execute justice and righteousness? You guys kind of see where I'm going with this? Oh, what's the next slide going to be? So the Bible actually, very subtle. We miss it so much, but it gives us a little subtle hint the chapter before in 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 15. And it says this. And this is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon drafted to build the house of the Lord and his own house, and the Millo, which is a rampart that the Israelites built to besiege the city from the Jebusites and later was formed into part of a palace, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazar, Megiddo, and Gezer. Forced labor. What's another name for that again? Slavery. The Bible kind of drops a bomb here. Kind of a big one. Because Solomon built his palace Khazar, Megiddo, and Gezer, which, if you keep reading, were military infrastructures. Okay? And the people he's put into slavery are the Canaanites and all of the other native people of the land that didn't die in the conquest. They're the weaker people. They're the oppressed people now. And he's using them as slaves to build all these things. And, he needs to build these military bases and fortify all these walls to make it secure. Why? Well, you need to protect the empire that you've built, the empire of wealth, right? And the house of the Lord was built with slave labor. Solomon uses slaves to build the temple for the God that frees slaves. See, in the Sinai incident, when the Torah was given, the gift to Israel was given. God said, listen, I know you're going to have kings one day, and there's 3 things. Just make sure they don't do these 3 things in Deuteronomy 17. Do I have it on here? I don't. So these 3 things are this. Starting in verse 16, in Deuteronomy 17. Only he, the king, your future king, must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. Not a lot of horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. So don't acquire many horses, and whatever you do, don't go to Egypt to get the horses, because you shall never return that way again. So we read that as also, don't go back to Egypt physically, don't become like Egypt. Stop it. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. He also has to write a copy of the Torah that's audited by the priest. Why? Why would he have to write a copy of the Torah that's audited by the priest to make sure it's correct, and he's to study it every day so that he will remember who he is in contrast to who God is and what God did, and God brought him out of Egypt to fear the Lord, because the Lord hears the cries of the oppressed. And Solomon broke like every one of these things. So right after the Queen of Sheba says all these things, in 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 26, this is what it says. It's a little bit of scripture. You guys don't mind, do you? So, and Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, and he stationed in the chariot cities, bunkers, and with the king in Jerusalem. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone. And he made cedar as plentiful as a sycamore and shephelah. And Solomon's import of horses were from Egypt and Cu. And the king's traders received them from Cu at a price. And a chariot could be imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. And so through the king's traders, they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites up north and Syria to the east. Horses and chariots. Do you know why the kings shouldn't have horses and chariots? Because horses and chariots were the fighter jets and tanks of this generation. They were the drones with Hellfire missiles. These were the squad automatic weapons of this time period. Where else do we see horses and chariots in Israel's story? The same story that we're reading. Oh, that's right. Egypt was chasing them with the war chariots. Not only did Solomon amass tons of horses and chariots, he specifically went to Egypt to import them into Israel. And then what's he do? He exports them to Syria and Hittites. Solomon becomes an arms dealer. And he profits off of war and violence. Spoiler alert. The high point of Israel is about to not be the high point of Israel. 1 Kings 11 starts out by telling us that Solomon also had 700 wives. What would possess? 700 wives and 300 concubines, foreign women that did cause his heart to commit idolatry. 1 Kings 10 actually tells us how much gold he accumulated. You guys want to know how much gold he accumulated every year? Now, the weight of the gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. Not everything we think is future. Not everything we think is past is past. The Bible is meant to speak to you in the here and the now. The Bible is meant to show you your heart here and now and show you the mission of God in your life here and now. 666 talents of gold. Solomon has become Pharaoh. Solomon, among his wives, married Pharaoh's daughter. Maybe he was trying to be more like his father-in-law. I don't know. After King David tells him to make sure you keep the Torah and make sure you do all these things of the Torah so you can be righteous, Solomon. King David then gives him a hit list like something out of The Godfather so he can go and slaughter all these enemies of David. It's seriously like a gangster movie when you read 1 Kings. Solomon has become Pharaoh. Israel has become Egypt. And the very thing God freed them from, the very thing God told them never to go back to, they've become. This Solomon, this son of David, has forgotten to fear the Lord, and he has forgotten who God is, and he has forgotten who he himself is. And he's building his own kingdom, not God's. And he's using the massive wealth and slave labor to expand the military strength of this kingdom, profiting off the weak and the poor and profiting off of war. Just as God warned, Solomon's heart truly is far from him. The Israelites begin viewing their blessings from God as favoritism and entitlement, a mistake that we can all participate in if we're not careful. The reality is God was giving those blessings so that the world would see him, not them. They received the blessings so that they could give blessings. And they were given blessings so that they could be the priests. And they forgot who they were. They forgot who they were. Prophets begin to rise up and challenge the leadership of Israel, saying, turn back, remember where you came from. Amos is one of the boldest prophets. They were all pretty bold. Amos 3 starts out with, hear this word, people of Israel, the word of the Lord has spoken against you, against the whole family. Why would the Lord be coming? Why is he coming against us, Amos? Why? The whole family I brought up out of Egypt, reminding them. They do not know how to do right, declares the Lord, who store up in their fortresses what they have plundered and looted. Plundered and looted from who? Or if they have fortresses, they're whoever they're stronger than. Whoever they can beat down and take from. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 13. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 13. Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me, says the Lord. Your new moons, your Sabbath, your convocations. I cannot bear your worthless assemblies. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer many prayers, I'm not listening. Your hands are full of blood. Can you imagine being the king and Isaiah's coming to you? This is what God says. The people have forgotten where they're from, and somehow they have created a religion that asserts worship of this redeeming God. The people have forgot who they were and what their vocation is, but somehow they have created a religion that asserts that they worship this redeeming God. And he hates it. And he hates their feasts. And when they did Sukkot, he hated it. And when they came together and celebrated Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, oh, it's so good to see you, he hated it. And when they participated in temple worship and said, God, merciful God, here is the incense for you, it made him want to vomit. And when they prayed to him, he was, who are you? You are not my people. You're just like the Egyptians. But now you're claiming that I'm your God? Watch out. It can happen to anybody. That can happen within any fellowship. It could happen here to you. And Amos uses the ultimate metaphorical insult in chapter 4. I love it. Chapter 4, verse 1, he's speaking to the women up in northern Israel. And, well, I'll just read it. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan of Mount Samaria. You big old cows. Cows of Bashan were like the most well-fed, like fat, like, yeah, them the fat milk cows. You cows of Bashan, you women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and then say to your husband, oh, bring me more drinks. This is a tremendously wealthy people. The women love their wealth so much. And where are they getting it from? From the poor. And they don't care what they're doing to the poor, what they're doing to enslave and oppress and kill and harm through violence. They don't care. Oh, they're big fat cows. Honey, can you get me another drink? Oppress. Who were we're still in the same story, right? Still in the same story. I know I'm jumping across large gaps of the Bible, but the same story. And so who were the oppressed near the beginning of the story? Israel. Where were they oppressed? Egypt. Okay, so we're still on the same page. This is the same people. And Amos was bold. In Amos 6:7, he tells the leadership, he's like, you're going to be the first to go into exile. Your feasting and lounging around, big old cows lounging around. Your feasting and lounging around will end. You will be the first. So in Amos 7, he's basically writing a letter to Jeroboam, king of Israel, and Amaziah, which is the priest of Bethel. So imagine the priest, big priest in Bethel, right? And they're going back and forth, and he's approaching this priest, and he's talking to him, and he's basically saying, listen, I'm not really a prophet. I wasn't trained as a prophet. I'm not a disciple. I'm a shepherd. I'm a shepherd. And God called me away from my flock to send a message to Israel and her kings. And he tells them that, you know what, guys? Like, your wives are going to be made to be prostitutes. And your kids are going to die, and the land's going to be polluted, and you're going to be in exile. You're going to go away in exile. Boldness. This happened. And Amos, along with Isaiah and Hosea, came to remind Israel of their past. Remember Egypt, remember God, remember the Exodus, remember Mount Sinai, remember who you are. That God has given you a vocation to be image bearers, and you're not recognizable anymore. And these prophets were scoffed at, threatened, and driven away. Now, of course, the ultimate consequence finally comes to Israel. Exile. The Assyrians come and they take away a huge part of the Israelite residents up north. And then even more emphasized in Scripture, Babylon comes and takes the rest to Babylon. The king of Babylon invades Israel. And in 2 Chronicles 36, it says the Babylonians came and they killed the women and the men and the kids and everybody. Elderly, killed everybody. And they torched God's house and they tore it down, God's temple. And they took all of the holy objects in the temple and they carried them all the way to Babylon. So these are people who are essentially pseudo-Egyptians now, but they're claiming that this God of Israel is theirs. And now they're watching this religion that they've essentially created. And they're watching the Ark of the Covenant be, and the menorah be, the table of showbread be walked away by these invaders. What is happening? And they're forced to go to Babylon to become servants. Servants. So they're taken against their will to a place that's not their home, and they're forced to become servants. What's that called again? They're right back where they started. Right back where they started. You see a problem here. It's a big deal. Because God's already redeemed them once, but something didn't happen that was supposed to happen. And they started, but they couldn't do it, and something happened, and they failed, and now they're right back again. Something bigger has to happen. Deuteronomy 28 lists the curses for disobeying God's decree and failing your vocation, for breaking the covenant. And do you know what the climax of the curses are in Deuteronomy 28? The curses speak about how you will be overtaken, defeated by your enemies. Horrible things will happen to you and your family. But finally, after all of this, it's not going to get any worse than this. We come across verse 64, the climax of the curse of the law. And the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other. That is the high point of the curse of the law. Exile. Disobedience results in exile. Exactly what took place in Babylon, exactly what took place in Assyria, all one story, exactly what took place in the garden. Exile. This is the garden happening over and over again. Something's not working. And Israel was experiencing this. The total loss of their homes, the total loss of their loved ones, their God even. The temple was destroyed. Everything that they worked for, their entire empire was destroyed. And sitting there in Babylon, Psalms 137 records a song and this testimony of the Israelites sitting there at the rivers of Babylon, yearning to be back in Jerusalem, back into their land. If I could go back, if I could have another chance, would I do it differently? Would I obey if I was able to come back? Would I choose to live in the life and power and the vocation that God gives me if I just had one second chance? If I could just go back one more time? Would I take up the role as a priest to the nations if I could just go back? And Deuteronomy 28 and 29 speaks about the curses of breaking God's covenant, but in chapter 30, something happened. God speaks of what will come after all of these curses. And he speaks about a hope. And Israel knew this hope. And while they're in Babylon, they're discussing this, and the prophets begin to speak. And this hope is this. In Deuteronomy 30, verse 2, and return to the Lord your God. If you return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice and all that I command you today with all your heart and with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you, and he will gather you again to all peoples, from all the people that he sent you to, where the Lord your God has scattered you. If your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will take you, and the Lord your God will bring you into the land, your land that your fathers possessed, and you may possess it. And he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. Kind of has the same type of language that Matthew 24 has in Mark 13, doesn't it? Corners of heaven and the elect. Okay, anyway. So we find ourselves in Egypt once again now. But God says he's going to bring us back out of Egypt. What does this look like? Well, the first time it was an exodus. So this is going to be like a second exodus. A second chance? I mean, it has to. Deuteronomy 30 says this. And Isaiah begins to speak up, and the prophets begin to speak up and telling Israel, yeah, God is planning to do something great. He's going to do something new. It's going to be greater. It's going to be the greatest thing ever. Isaiah speaks about how God's going to pardon your sins, and you will return from exile. And Isaiah 40, the prophet speaks about his people mounting up on wings of eagles when this happens. Wings of eagles. Where did we read about bearing up on wings of eagles? Oh yeah, the first Exodus. It's Exodus language that's being portrayed here through the prophets. Isaiah 11 speaks about a king that's going to come, a branch of Jesse. Jesse? Who's Jesse? Who's Jesse? David's father. So this lineage from Jesse, David's father, this David figure is prophesied to come. And wisdom and understanding will be upon him, knowledge and fear of the Lord. He will pursue justice and righteousness for the poor and the meek. This figure, this David, or lineage of David, or son of David, is going to come, and all people will see and inquire of him, is what the prophecy says. And his resting place will be glorious, is what Isaiah 11 says. Wait. They're going to come and inquire of him, and everything his kingdom is going to be glorious. Didn't that already happen with Solomon? Because didn't the pagans come and inquire of Solomon, wanting to ask him hard questions and see his wisdom and his glorious kingdom? Surely God is with you. But this isn't speaking about Solomon. This is speaking about another son of David that's going to come, the anti-Solomon. Isaiah 11:11. In that day the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time. The Lord will extend his hand a second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people. From Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush to Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea. He will raise up a signal for all nations, and will assemble the banished of Israel, and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the world. This son of David is coming, and it's going to change everything. God is going to redeem Israel a second time. This is what the prophets are speaking about. The son of David is coming to change everything. And God is saying through the prophets that he's going to redeem Israel a second time, and he's going to rescue them a second time, and there will be a second Exodus. And this one will be greater. This will be a new Exodus that is coming to the exiles of Israel. Isaiah 43:19 says, behold, I'm doing a new thing. Everybody say a new thing. Behold, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and the rivers in the desert. In this Exodus, they will be brought to a new thing. Not like the former Exodus. No. The first Exodus wasn't big enough for what God is going to do now. The first Exodus was just a hint of the redemptive work that God is going to do now. The first Exodus brought Israel out of bondage, and within a few generations, they were slaves again by the Babylonians. This Exodus will be greater. It will be bigger and more lasting than any before. It has to be. It has to be. Or else, what will keep this from happening again? God can redeem us just like the last Exodus, but what's going to keep this from happening again? The prophets realized and were saying that this issue wasn't simply Egypt. The issue wasn't Egypt, and it wasn't Pharaoh, and it wasn't Babylon. It was something deeper rooted than that. This was the dark evolution of the hearts of man. This is the Egypt that we're born into. They began to realize that this exile that we're in Babylon, it's not about Babylon. It's about the world. It's about all of God's creation. We're called to be a kingdom of priests to the nations. Why? Because the nations are having issues too. Maybe there's a greater exile here. Maybe there's a greater exile that has nothing to do with geographic location. And if there's a greater exile that's inflicting all of mankind that we had a vocation of being image bearers for and the priest of, then there has to be a greatest exodus that needs to take place. And not just bring us out of Babylon and back into this geographical location, but all nations need to come out of wherever they are trapped and enslaved to. This needs to be a greater exodus that has to happen. And this is exactly what the prophets are saying. This is what has enslaved us. This is an Egypt that we're all born into, our hearts are enslaved to. And Isaiah keeps prophesying all the way through up to Isaiah 66:18, where his vision encapsulates all people from all nations joining this exodus, not just from Babylon. This newer second greatest exodus is coming. And God is promising this, and God is going to bring his kingdom here, and his new exodus will overtake the world. And Jeremiah says in chapter 31 that this new covenant will be made with his people. And the people that do his will, this is his people that he's going to make this covenant for. And it will not be something that allows the heart to go unchanged when this new covenant comes to reality. It's not something that will leave you going back and chasing another exile. It's something that will make a change. This exodus, this new Sinai experience will transform your heart. God's intentions, love, mercy, and his Torah will now be written on your heart. It's going to change something bigger than simply your geographical location. This people will be the new Exodus people. And the prophet speaks about Jerusalem being redesigned, expanded even. Not only will all the prophets from all nations all people from all nations, everybody from different backgrounds be entering into Jerusalem, but Zechariah 2:4 says that Jerusalem will not have any walls. No bricks. No bricks. No boundaries. This new exodus back to this new Jerusalem, back to this new world. Isaiah starts speaking about his altars. This is a kicker. This is amazing. So Isaiah 19 through 25. Go ahead and just mark that in your notes. Isaiah 19 through 25. Because Isaiah speaks about when this new Exodus happens, altars will be set up in Egypt that worship him. Now, I love temple stuff, guys. I really do. And I'm racking my brain. I'm like, that can't happen because of Kedusha and levels of Kedusha. And Egypt does not have like a Temple Mount Jerusalem equivalent level of Kedusha. But the prophet speaks. And here's what the prophet says. He says that when this new Exodus occurs, Egypt will have an altar dedicated to God. And Egypt will be God's people after this happens. And Egypt and Assyria will worship God together. And there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria. What's in between Egypt and Assyria? Israel. Israel's a mediator? I don't know. And he goes on to say that Israel will be the third between them. He calls Egypt my people, Assyria is my people, and Israel my inheritance. He doesn't call Israel the leader. He calls Israel the third of the three. Israel is equal to Egypt and Assyria now. What is that? Why? They're enemies. They're enemies with each other. How are they going to be? They will join with their enemies in worshiping God. Enemies will be loving one another through the experience and transforming power of God. That's what Isaiah prophesied. That all nations, enemies of each other, will put down their arms and they will begin to love each other. That sounds so familiar. Who said that? Who talks about loving their... I don't know. We'll have to... Truly, this greater exodus is coming. And the day when all nations come together with mutual respect, love, and grace for one another under God's reigning kingdom is what these prophets are talking about. And this exodus is not just going to be for Israel. It's going to be for the entire world, all nations. This great event will mark the bringing in of all nations, exactly what Israel was charged to do. Isaiah continues to say that God is changing. Or he's changing creation. He's going to make a new heavens and a new earth. God's going to implement a new creation, is what Isaiah is speaking about. This is Genesis language. In this new world, the wolf will lie down with the lamb. In this new world, according to Isaiah, the deserts, the barren wastelands will sprout up, and they will be as the Garden of Eden. They will be as Eden. Like a garden. The desert. Probably not that sound effect, but just flowers shooting out everywhere. Where God's reign will be fully manifest, where the wolf truly will rest with the lamb. Isaiah 51:3 says that the deserts will flourish with new life. There's a new servant coming, and there's a new king that's coming, not like Solomon. No, he's another son of David. And Isaiah 42 states that he will execute justice and righteousness. Isaiah 9 states that he will be the Prince of Peace, not an arms dealer. That he will proclaim the good news to the poor. Isaiah 52, in describing the son of David figure, it says, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely." Now, Solomon was described as being wise, right? But his wisdom only went so far. He abused the blessing of God. He abused the wisdom for its own sake. This new son of David will not become unfaithful to God's covenant. There is huge hope. Imagine being in Babylon, and the prophets are telling you this. You're starting to get excited. He's going to lead a new exodus. The prophets further this Davidic narrative by saying David will reign forever in Ezekiel 37:25 and Jeremiah 33:17. This messianic figure will reign forever. This is the seed that crushes the serpent's head. This is the one greater than Moses. This is the son of David that will reign forever. And Isaiah 40, and we're going to read a few verses here. Isaiah 40 says this, and Isaiah 40 is specifically about God redeeming his people and bringing them home, this second exodus, this greater exodus that's going to happen. He says, "Comfort, comfort my people," says God. Says your God, "Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her, and her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned, and that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all of her sins. But a voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley will be lifted up, every mountain will be brought low, and uneven ground will become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." Isaiah actually calls this new exodus the way. These are the promises made by the prophets. The promises of return, the promises of something bigger than simply dwelling in a geographical location. We know Persia invaded Babylon, okay? We know that. And we know that Israel was able to come home, but even Nehemiah and Ezra, they cry out, they say, we're still slaves in our own land. Being home geographically did not mean that redemption from exile had occurred yet. We're home, we're back, and this stinks. They went and they rebuilt the temple, and they couldn't even they had to make the menorah out of tin, I believe, because they couldn't have all the resources. They didn't have the gold to make it properly. And they rebuilt the second temple, and guys, it was not pretty. It was kind of ugly. This is why it was such a big deal when King Herod did his makeover of the temple. It was beautiful then. But before that, no. And the glory never manifests back in the second temple. They're still in exile. And they realized it. When will this exile end? The prophecy from Babylon was supposed to be 70 years, but then Daniel comes along and throws a bomb in that, 7 times 70. What does that mean? When is the exile going to end? The Persians get taken out by the Greeks, and then the Judean community rises up with violence to proclaim victory over their own land, and then they become just like Egyptians real quick in the generation after that. And then the Romans come in and take them over, and now they're living in a land where they can't even go to the temple without looking at this building that the Romans built right beside it, this huge armory that's actually a few feet taller than the temple, just to let them know that you're still small. When the Roman guards come through your town and say, hey, carry my backpack for me. Hey, you, go get taxes from your own people. This is not redemption. This is not the end of the exile. What is happening? When will this end? A highly debated verse in Exodus 12:40, it's fascinating, states that Israel was in Egypt for 430 years before Moses was born. Lots of conversations about this verse and commentary because, anyway. And it's, so roughly 430 years, and it's fascinating because Nehemiah returned from Babylon at around 430 BCE, or 433 BCE. So it's 430 years in Egypt before Moses was born, and Nehemiah came home around 433 BCE before Yeshua was born. Worship team, you guys can go ahead and get set up as we conclude. I'm concluding the message. All four Gospels, guys, and this is the lens I want you guys to have. All four Gospels, although very different in how they portray Yeshua, we spoke about this last week. All four Gospels are not supposed to sync up nicely. They're meant to be unique. They all contain one single reference revolving around Yeshua, one single reference to a prophecy. And they all four assert that Yeshua is fulfilling this prophecy. And Mark starts his gospel out by that. We read it last week in Mark chapter 1. Mark chapter 1, verse 1 says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it was written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Didn't we just read that in Isaiah 40? That was the prophecy about the greater exodus, this greatest exodus that's coming, right? Mark is asserting that this is the purpose of Yeshua. He is going to lead this exodus. So who is this Yeshua? Why does he? What does he have to do with this greater exodus of God that he promised? Well, when we read the Gospels, we see people giving him a title. The blind man in Mark 10 sees Yeshua, or hears about Yeshua coming, and he wants to get his attention. And so he cries out, Son of David, have mercy. Son of David. The Canaanite woman in Matthew 15 screams out, have mercy on me, Son of David. In Matthew 21, the crowd scream out, Hosanna, Son of David. This is the Son of David that was promised. Not Solomon, but the true Son of David that is going to lead this greater exodus. Bring us exodus, bring us home. That's the cry. Reconcile us to God, O Prince of Peace. Mighty Counselor, Emmanuel, meaning God is with us. The servant, the King, the Son of David, the branch of the Lord, the Son of God, the light to the nations, the Redeemer, the Savior, the greater Moses. This is a story about the person of Yeshua, who in him the promises of God do find their fulfillment. And so we're going to continue the story of God's mission next week and explore just how great Passover should be to believers in this Son of David. And maybe this story is already starting to speak to you. I don't know. Maybe you have experienced the story of the garden in your life. Maybe God has been calling your name, asking, where are you? Did you leave the garden? Did you leave the place where God wanted you to be? The Exodus is not simply something that happened a long time ago in the place of Egypt. Guys, it can happen today. And it can happen to you. And there is a greater redemption available. And I would ask, have you experienced the new life? Have you experienced the new creation? Do you experience this greatest exodus? You can in Yeshua. That's what the scriptures tell us. And I don't know if you're going through a time in your life right now where you need prayer, where you need support, where you need encouragement, where you need to know that God does care about you. But I'd invite you. We have a prayer team that will be right here, and they're available. And if that's you today, then I want you to know that God is here for you. And there can be comfort, just like Isaiah 40 states. There can be peace, and you can return home via the greatest exodus. Thank you.
Shalom, I'm Matthew Vanderels, and I hope you enjoyed this message. Founded in Truth exists to cultivate a fellowship of image bearers that live the redeemed life only Yeshua can give. If this ministry has been a blessing to you, we would love to hear from you. Send us an email through the contact form on our website and tell us how God has used this ministry to edify your faith and relationship with Him. If you'd like to see more messages like this one, subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking here. If you'd like to donate to this ministry and be a part of what God is doing through it, you can donate through our online giving portal here. We thank you for your continued support, and we look forward to next time. Shalom.